They thought a bullet would break her. They thought pain would bring her down. But when she remained standing, blood dripping, eyes locked, and unshaken, they froze. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind carried the silence like a threat. Before the gunshot, before the betrayal, before the blood soaked her shirt, Amira Vale had been nothing more than a name whispered in forgotten corners of the conflict. Now she stood in plain sight, shoulder torn and bleeding, and yet rooted like iron into the cracked earth. It had begun, as most tragedies do, with trust. Just 2 weeks earlier, she was leading a convoy of relief supplies through the Rikari corridor, a war-ravaged region caught between two brutal factions. Amira wasn't military, she wasn't even armed. She was something worse to tyrants, an idealist, and worse still, a survivor with a cause. The truck she drove had bullet holes patched with duct tape and a faded sticker that read, "Peace is a gun unloaded." She had lost people too many. Friends turned martyrs, villages turned graves. And still she moved forward, convinced that hope could be hand-delivered in the form of antibiotics, food rations, and blankets. But she didn't see what was waiting behind checkpoint Delta 7. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The men at the barrier wore civilian clothes, no uniforms, no insignia, just eyes too still, and weapons too clean. Amira slowed the truck, she waved from behind the cracked windshield. They didn't wave back. Instead, a young man stepped forward, tall, tanned, and barefoot, and motioned her to step out. Her second-in-command, a boy barely 19 named Luen, leaned toward her from the passenger seat. "This feels wrong." Amira nodded slightly, but she opened the door anyway. Sometimes survival means walking into danger like you expected it to be there. She stepped onto the gravel, hands raised, smile practiced. "I'm Amira Vale. We're here with humanitarian aid. No weapons, just food and medical supplies." The barefoot man tilted his head, and no lies. The question cut sharp. She felt it before she saw it. The shift in air. The glint of steel from behind the crates. The way the world seemed to exhale before violence. The gunshot cracked like lightning. She didn't fall. She didn't scream. She took the bullet to the shoulder, and stood still. Even the dust around her seemed to hesitate. The barefoot man blinked, lowered his rifle by an inch. "What are you?" he whispered. She didn't answer. Amira just stared back, eyes unblinking, as blood painted her shirt in red halos. Behind her, Luen shouted something too distant, too muffled by adrenaline. Another gun was raised. Another voice barked orders. And then chaos broke loose. But by then, the myth had already begun. The woman who didn't fall. The one who took a bullet like it was nothing, and stayed standing. In the hours that followed, soldiers would whisper her name like a curse. Children would draw her silhouette in the dirt, and one man, one traitor, would wonder why he hadn't aimed for her heart. What they didn't know was this: Amira Vale had already been shot once before, and that wound never healed. This time, she wasn't just carrying medicine. She was carrying a message, and no bullet could silence it. The wound hadn't killed her, but it had started something. By nightfall, her convoy was gone, hijacked, stripped and burning somewhere beyond the ridge. Luen had dragged her behind a boulder after the ambush, pressing a cloth to her shoulder as she bit back a scream. She didn't lose consciousness, but she lost time. Minutes blurred into shadows, shadows into nightmares. When she opened her eyes, the world was red. Not from blood but from the burning horizon. They'd lit the supplies on fire. Everything she'd gathered, medkits, vaccines, baby formula, smoldered in a funeral pyre. It wasn't just an ambush. It was a message. They weren't just raiders, Luen whispered beside her. There's no way they knew our route unless— His voice trailed off. Unless someone told them. Someone inside. Her chest ached worse than her shoulder, not from the bullet, but from the thought of betrayal. Amira didn't have the luxury of trust. Her convoy had only 12 people, and 6 of them were dead. 3 others were missing. That left 2, her and Luen. She winced as she tried to sit up. I need you to find the others, she murmured. Luen hesitated. You're in no shape to move. I didn't ask if I could move, she said. I asked you to find them. Luen stood. The fire flickered in his wide, terrified eyes. He nodded and slipped into the night. Amira didn't waste time. She tore a strip of fabric from her shirt, tightened it around the wound, and bit down as pain flared white-hot across her shoulder. Then she began to crawl. Every inch of earth scraped against her ribs, but she didn't stop. Somewhere out there, the ones who betrayed her were watching, laughing, celebrating. She wouldn't let that last. She reached the edge of a dry creek bed and found tracks, boots, 4 sets, heading south. Too precise, too deliberate. Not scavengers, not looters, professionals. She had worked too long in war zones not to recognize the signs. These weren't opportunists. These were executioners, and someone had sent them with her name in their mouths. The next morning, a dust storm hit. She wrapped her face in cloth and moved with the wind, half hidden, half hunted. Then she found the first body. It was Aaliyah, one of her drivers. Throat slit, eyes open. Amira closed them with shaking fingers. Pinned to the corpse's vest was a folded piece of paper. A symbol drawn in ash, 2 jagged circles crossing like scars. She knew that symbol. Everyone in Rakarat did. It belonged to the Kavari Syndicate, a paramilitary ghost army that operated in silence, fed off chaos, and answered to no nation. They had no flag, only marks. And Amira had marked them years ago. They hadn't forgotten. She stared at the paper, her jaw locked. This wasn't about stealing supplies. It was about her, and someone close had sold her name. The betrayal ran deeper than she'd thought. She looked up at the clouded sun, its light dimmed by sand and war. Come find me, she whispered into the wind. Let's finish what you started. And somewhere not far behind her, a figure watched from the rocks. Luen had returned, but not to help, not to protect. He was no longer Amira's second in command. He was their eyes now, and he had one job left. Make sure she didn't survive the second shot. The desert had many ways of killing, but betrayal was the cruelest. Amira moved with a limp, her wounded arm tied across her chest with makeshift bandages. Her steps were slow, but her eyes burned with clarity. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, hadn't slept in 1. But there was something inside her now that refused to collapse. Vengeance wasn't fuel, it was gravity. Every path led downward toward it. She followed the tracks toward the abandoned way station near the old mines, once a smuggler's den, now just a ruin. It was where she'd hidden her contingency supplies months ago, just in case. Just in case people she trusted turned into ghosts with guns. She reached the station by twilight. A rusted gate hung open like a broken jaw. Inside the silence echoed. No gunfire, no movement, just her heartbeat thudding louder than the wind. She found the crate where she'd left it, beneath a false floor, under a metal grate burned black from years of furnace heat. She pulled it open. Inside a satellite phone, 2 loaded pistols, a canteen, and a flash drive wrapped in cloth. The flash drive was more valuable than any bullet. It held files, evidence of Kavari executions, locations of illegal arms transfers, even blackmail ledgers that could collapse powerful warlords if leaked. She hadn't dared to release it before. But now she had nothing to lose, except the last breath in her body. She heard the footstep behind her a second too late. She rolled, the bullet whistled past her head and exploded against the wall. She landed hard, shoulder first, biting down on a scream as pain tore through her. Luen stepped into the open. He didn't look angry, just resigned. You were supposed to die at the checkpoint, he said. Amira laughed bitterly through gritted teeth. You sound disappointed. Luen raised the gun again. I warned them you were too stubborn, but they said a shot to the shoulder would be enough. She stared up at him. At what price? He hesitated. Your name bought immunity, he said finally. They let me live. So you sold mine. It was the only way out. Her eyes didn't blink. I carried you through 7 checkpoints. I buried your brother with my own hands. And this is what you are now? Luwen's hand trembled. I didn't want this, he whispered. I just wanted to live. Amira's fingers curled around the pistol in the crate. And I want you to die with that truth on your lips. He fired again. She twisted. The second shot grazed her side. But she had already drawn her weapon. She fired once clean. Luen dropped to his knees. Eyes wide, blood blooming across his chest. Amira stood slowly, biting through the agony pulsing through her body. I trusted you, she said quietly. He collapsed without answering. The dust settled around her, and just like before, she remained standing. Alone, bleeding, but unbroken. She limped to the edge of the station, scanned the horizon. They'd come looking now. They'd know she was still alive, and this time, she wouldn't wait for them. She picked up the flash drive, and slipped it into her pocket. Time to turn their silence into screams. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and betrayal, as Amira climbed the ridge behind the station. She had barely wrapped her side, when the satellite phone began to blink. A weak signal. Enough. She crouched under a half-buried slab of metal, balancing the phone on her knee, as she inserted the flash drive. For a second, nothing happened. Then the screen lit up, folders upon folders of raw files, surveillance photos, voice recordings, coordinates, every secret the Kavari syndicate had tried to bury beneath bodies and silence. She selected a handful of the worst. Then she opened the emergency contact app, encrypted, anonymous, set to broadcast to 3 places at once: a war crimes tribunal, an underground media outlet, and an exiled journalist she trusted with her life. She attached the files, typed one line into the subject box. You should have aimed for my heart. Then she hit send. The phone beeped once, then the signal died, but the job was done. Somewhere in the world, eyes were opening. Somewhere names were about to burn. Amira leaned her head back and stared at the sky. She expected satisfaction. She felt only cold resolve. The kind that comes when your mission isn't over, just changed. Suddenly, a shadow crossed the ridge. She spun, weapon raised. But it wasn't a soldier. It was a girl barely 13, with soot on her cheeks and a knife clutched tightly in both hands. Amira froze. The girl didn't speak. She just looked at the blood, the phone, the gun, and didn't flinch. You alone? Amira asked. The girl nodded. Then she pointed to the valley below. A plume of smoke. Refugee camp, most likely. Or what was left of one. Amira followed the girl down the rocks. Each step jarred her wounds. But the girl never once offered help, only walked ahead, sure-footed and silent. When they reached the camp, Amira understood. Tents ripped to shreds, water tanks punctured, dozens of bodies. And yet among the ruins, a handful of survivors remained, mostly children, watching her with hollow eyes. One of them recognized her. Are you the one who stood up after they shot you? Amira didn't answer. Instead she knelt and opened her bag. She gave the canteen to the smallest child first, then pulled out a heat blanket, bandages, what little she had. The girl who led her there finally spoke. They came looking for you. Amira didn't ask who. She already knew. The man in charge said, if anyone helped you, they'd all die. The girl added, why did you help me then? Amira asked. The girl's eyes didn't blink. Because I saw you stand. That night, Amira stayed by the fire with a rifle in her lap. The children slept in a circle around her, trusting her with the little safety they had left. In the darkness beyond, she saw movement, Kavari scouts, no doubt. But they didn't approach. Maybe it was the broadcast. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the legend forming in their minds. The woman who couldn't be brought down, who took bullets like vows, and still stood guard over the broken. Whatever it was, they stayed back. For now, but Amira knew better. This wasn't over. It was only the eye of the storm. And when it passed, she'd be ready. Because this time, she wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting to be seen. At dawn the first scream shattered the silence. Amira was already on her feet, rifle raised, eyes sweeping the horizon. But it wasn't an attack. It was grief. One of the boys, Tariq, the smallest, had slipped away in the night, wandered too far past the camp's edge, and stepped on a pressure mine. The blast had taken everything below his knees. By the time Amira reached him, he was gone. The children didn't cry. They just sat in a circle, staring at the dark patch of earth, the silence between them louder than any weeping could have been. Amira knelt beside them, her hand trembling over the rifle. She had buried too many. She didn't even know how to speak the words anymore. But then the girl, Inari, stepped forward. She stared down at Tariq's remains and said, "This isn't what death is. Not anymore." Amira looked at her, confused. Inari pointed to Amira's shoulder, still bandaged, still bleeding. "You were supposed to be a memory," she said. "They said no one survives Kavari fire." And yet, Amira muttered, "Here I am." Inari looked at the other children. "What if we become the ones who stand too?" It was a question, but it echoed like a vow. Later that day, Amira hobbled to the edge of the valley, and spotted dust clouds. Vehicles. They were coming. Not bandits, not scavengers, military-grade transports, Kavari elite. She had maybe 3 hours. She turned back to the camp. Only scraps of wood, one pistol, a bolt-action rifle, with 2 bullets left. 12 children, half of them sick or limping. No soldiers, no army, just will. But sometimes, will is enough. She gathered them around the campfire, and laid out the truth. "They're coming for me. You can run. You should run. I won't stop you." Nobody moved. Inari stood straighter. "If they want you, they'll have to come through us." A flicker of pride burned in Amira's chest, but it frightened her, too. They weren't soldiers. They were orphans, refugees, children with dust in their lungs, and war behind their eyes. But they were hers now, and she had one last card to play. Amira reached into her coat, and pulled out the flash drive's twin, the fail-safe, a second copy, unbroadcasted. She handed it to Inari. "If I fall, you run. Find the old rail station. There's a man there named Jiva. He'll know what to do." Inari took it without question. No fear, only fire. Amira stared at the horizon again. The vehicles were closer now, engines humming like vultures, circling the dead. She checked her rifle. 2 rounds, one for them, one for her, if it came to that. She'd never planned to become a symbol, but sometimes symbols are born from blood and silence. She wiped her face clean. Then she stood tall, shoulder burning, knees aching, and waited. Behind her, the children didn't cower. They stood too. Inari at the center, clutching a blade with both hands, feet planted. When the dust clouds reached the edge of the camp, the Kavari soldiers dismounted, slowly, cautiously, guns raised. But they didn't charge, because standing before them was a woman they thought had died twice. And she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by shadows that refused to stay hidden, by children who didn't cry anymore, by truth wrapped in scars and flame. The Kavari didn't open fire. Not yet. They hesitated. And Amira saw it, the first crack, the beginning of fear. And fear, she knew, could be louder than bullets. The air stilled as the Kavari soldiers spread out, rifles raised, fingers trembling. They hadn't expected a standoff. They had expected a cleanup, an execution, a woman half dead, crawling through sand. Not this, not her, not a wall of children, staring them down like ghosts, who had nothing left to lose. Amira didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything, defiant, blood-stained, unshaken. The man who stepped forward wore a black scarf over his mouth, and mirrored goggles. He raised a hand, signaling his men to hold. "Amira Vale," he said, "you should have died 3 days ago." She tilted her head. "You sound disappointed." He ignored the jab. Instead he motioned to the children behind her. "You're protecting strays. Filth. What do you think this proves?" "That your bullets are scared of children," she said coldly. that even your silence flinches when truth stands tall. He took a slow step forward. Amira's finger rested gently on her rifle's trigger. I'm not here to negotiate, he warned. I came to end a loose thread. Then pull it, she said, voice flat. See what unravels. Behind her Inari didn't move, not even as the rifles adjusted aim. Not even as one soldier whispered, she's bluffing, she's got nothing. That's when Amira pulled out the satellite phone. The cracked screen still flickered with a single alert. File delivery confirmed. She held it up for all of them to see. I already sent it. To tribunals. To journalists. To your enemies. She lowered the phone. You're already ghosts. You just haven't realized you're dead yet. The commander's knuckles tightened on his weapon. He wanted to shoot. He needed to. But the fear had already begun. One of the soldiers stepped back. Another glanced sideways. Uncertain. Doubt is a disease, and it spreads fast. Then came the sound they weren't prepared for. A distant roar overhead. Engines. Jets. Military grade. The commander looked up, and for the first time his voice cracked. You called them. Amira didn't blink. You called them, she said. She pointed to the sky. To yourself. With every body you buried. Every lie you told. Every child you broke. As the jet screamed closer, the Kavari troops faltered. Two began backing away. The commander turned, furious. Hold your ground, we finish this now. But the wind shifted again, and with it came another sound. Sirens. Armored vehicles cresting the ridge. International markings. United coalition. Too late for most. Just in time for what mattered. The children didn't cheer. They didn't cry. They simply stood, as if this too was part of the storm. The Kavari broke formation. Some ran. Some dropped weapons. And the commander. He turned one last time to face Amira. You don't win, he said. She stepped forward, bleeding but unbroken. No, she whispered. We outlive. The jet passed overhead with a thunder that silenced even the wind. And when the dust cleared, Amira was still standing. A shoulder ruined, a body broken, but a legend carved in silence. When the smoke faded and the sky quieted, the camp was no longer just a ruin. It was a line in the sand, a declaration. The United Coalition soldiers moved quickly, clearing the valley, detaining the few Kavari stragglers, and setting up emergency med tents. But the children didn't move. They stood in place until Amira told them it was over. Only then did Inari finally unclench the blade from her fingers. A medic rushed to Amira with gauze and morphine. She waved it off. I'll patch up after, she said. There's something I need to do first. She walked limping to the field where the jets had passed. There a camera drone hovered silently, blinking red, streaming to coalition headquarters. Live. She stepped into frame. The soldiers nearby tried to stop her. She ignored them. My name is Amira Vale, she said clearly. You may have heard lies. That I'm a rebel, a smuggler, a traitor. You've heard I died, maybe more than once. She looked straight into the lens. But I'm still here. She held up the flash drive's twin. The files I've sent are real. They are proof of war crimes, of the Kavari syndicate's slaughter across the Rakaretsu, of those who funded it, enabled it, covered it up. She paused, trembled, but stood taller. To those in power who said I was disposable, look again. I'm not the one who needs to hide. The feed broadcast live across outposts, tribunals, media circuits, and far beyond. People saw her, bloodied, exhausted, but unbroken. The woman who stood through a bullet, who rose from fire, who stood with children and dared a syndicate to shoot her again. Back in the camp, Inari listened with quiet awe. This is how it ends, she asked. Amira turned to her. No, she said softly. This is how it begins. By nightfall the coalition established a protection perimeter. Doctors arrived, supplies returned, dignitaries reached out. But the real war wasn't over, not in Amira's heart, because as she stared into the fire that night, she remembered every face that hadn't made it. Alaya, Tariq, even Luan, names, voices,
shadows, the price of standing. And yet she had stood. She had not fallen, even when the world aimed to silence her. In the days that followed, officials tried to coax her into protection. A safe house, new identity, disappear quietly, let them clean it up. But Amira refused. I won't be a ghost, she said. I've already died once, that's enough. Instead she chose to stay in the Rakaretsa Corps, to rebuild, to teach the children how to stand too. And though her body would never heal the same, her name began to spread like fire across borders. Whispers turned to stories, stories into symbols. They shot her in the shoulder, but she never fell, and they froze, not because she was unkillable, but because in her, they saw something they had lost long ago, a reason to be afraid of those who refused to vanish. Weeks passed, but the scar across Amira's shoulder never faded. It pulsed in the cold and burned under the heat, but she wore it like armor, like proof that she had survived something designed to erase her. The Rakaretsa corridor slowly began to breathe again. Under coalition watch, a temporary ceasefire held, and humanitarian aid flowed through gates that once swallowed convoys whole. But Amira didn't rest. She couldn't. Instead she trained, not herself, but the children. They called it the line, a row of white stones at the edge of the rebuilt camp, where each child stood each morning, shoulders square, eyes forward. It wasn't about war. It was about presence, discipline, resilience. Amira taught them how to hide, how to speak without sound, how to protect what little still mattered. Inari was the first to ask what they were really preparing for. Didn't we win? She said one evening, sitting beside Amira by the fire. No, Amira answered. We survived. Inari frowned, but the soldiers left. The Kavari haven't come back. That doesn't mean they're gone, Amira said. They're watching. They always are. But why us? Amira turned to her. Because we proved we could stand. That terrifies them more than bullets ever could. Inari was silent. Then she said something Amira wasn't ready for. I think we should teach others. Amira blinked. What do you mean? Not just us, Amira said. Other children, other camps, other corridors. Make more lines. The fire crackled, and in that moment, something shifted. A legacy was forming, without blood, without politics, just resolve. Amira stood and looked around the camp. The same children who once flinched at thunder now slept through the wind without fear. And she realized something terrifying and beautiful. The Kavari hadn't created victims. They had created witnesses. And witnesses, when given truth, could become a movement. So she said yes. The next morning, Amira drafted a plan. 12 outposts, 7 secure trails, a rotating schedule of messengers. She called it Project Standpoint. At its core were the children, not soldiers, not rebels, messengers, trainers, guards of the forgotten. It began with simple drills, then small radios, encrypted signals, and soon whispers across cities. She's still alive. She's teaching them to rise. She stood. Now they will too. At first the Kavari left. Then they tried to hunt again. But every trap they set came back empty. Every informant they planted vanished into smoke. Because the children had learned, and they were no longer waiting to be saved. They had become the line. And the world was finally paying attention. Word of the line spread faster than bullets. Not through official channels, but through whispers, graffiti, broken radios, patched by children, with dirt under their nails. Across the fractured cities of Rakaretsit, the phrase began appearing. She stood. So will we. It wasn't a slogan. It was a warning. To the Kavari. To the ones in power. To the world. Amira kept moving between outposts, her shoulders stiffer each week, her steps heavier, but her fire never dimmed. Inari traveled with her now, her shadow, her student, her mirror. At each location, Amira knelt beside children who had never known peace, and taught them what it looked like to stand still and unafraid. No rifles, no violence, just the discipline of presence, the strength of saying, we are still here. But as the line grew, so did the threats. One night, at an outpost near the river, a child named Kale found a symbol burned into a tree. The two crossed circles of the Kavari. Amira's hand hovered over the scar on her shoulder. "We don't run," Inari said, echoing her old words back at her. But Amira shook her head. "We don't run," she agreed. "But we don't stand in the open either." They moved fast that night, relocated the children, before the strike could come. And it did come. At dawn, drones passed overhead. An airstrike followed, loud, surgical, cruel. The outpost vanished in smoke, but not one child died, because they had learned from her. Amira watched from the cliffs above, fury burning behind her calm eyes. "They're escalating," Inari whispered. "No," Amira replied. "They're unraveling." She sent a single message through the last working transmitter that night. "We see you. We outlive you. Keep sending fire. We remain." And that message, meant for the Kavari, echoed across continents. Journalists picked it up. Activists quoted it. Children in exile repeated it like a prayer. Amira had never meant to be a symbol. But now she was more than that. She was proof that pain didn't always break you, that sometimes it built an army. And yet something darker was coming. One night, as Amira rested against a wall in a shelter carved into stone, Inari approached with a radio she had tuned herself. A voice crackled through the static. Male, cold, familiar. "Tell her we know where she sleeps now. We know what she's building. We know who gave her the second drive." Amira sat up straight. That wasn't a threat. That was knowledge. Too specific. Too timed. Someone had betrayed them again. Not a child this time. Not a soldier. Someone closer. Someone who knew about Kavan. About the failsafe. Amira stared into the dust blowing across the canyon. Not afraid. Not even angry. Just clear. "They want me isolated," she said. Inari stepped closer. "They want you silenced." Amira looked at her. "They'll have to try harder." She rose to her feet, shouldering her rifle. Because
Jeevan hadn't been seen since the siege of Dorn Point. Some claimed he'd been executed by the Kavari, others whispered he'd defected, but Amira knew better. There were some people who didn't die easily, only disappeared until the world needed them again. And now, it seemed, the world was screaming for him. 3 days after the airstrike, Inari intercepted a strange signal on a stolen frequency. It wasn't a distress call, it was a riddle. "When the flame won't die, come to where stone drinks sky." Amira read the words again and again. She recognized the phrasing. Jeevan had taught her the code years ago, when she was still bleeding truth in underground newsprints. It pointed to one place, the Skywell Monastery, long abandoned, hidden at the edge of the Merry Cliffs. It used to be a place for the blind to learn how to see. Now it would be a meeting ground for ghosts. Amira and Inari took the risk. They moved through enemy checkpoints disguised as wandering traders. They crossed dry ravines and triggered no sensors. When they reached the monastery, the air was thin, like breathing in a memory, and he was there. Sitting under the shattered archway, wrapped in a dark cloak, hands bandaged in white linen stained with old fire. Jeevan, older now, slower in movement, but quicker in understanding. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," he said, voice rough as gravel. Amira stared at his hands. "What happened?" "They tried to extract the passcode. And they failed." She didn't ask how. He didn't explain. Instead, he pulled a small obsidian drive from his cloak. "The second fail-safe," he said. "And the last." Inari stepped forward. "What does it do?" Jeevan looked at her, then back at Amira. "It contains a map," he said. "Not to a place, to the truth." Amira frowned, meaning, "It outlines every shipment, every order, every Kavari weapon run through Rakari in the last decade." He paused. "And who funded them?" Amira felt something tighten in her chest. That was the kind of truth people died for, or killed for. "Why now?" she asked. Jeevan looked out toward the sky. "Because they've started hunting children." That was enough. She took the drive. And for a moment, none of them spoke. Because the air around them had shifted. It was no longer a question of resistance. It was a countdown. As they prepared to leave, Jeevan gave Amira one last thing, a photo, black and white, of a woman older than Amira, but with her eyes. "Who is this?" Amira asked. Jeevan hesitated. "Your mother," he said, "before she became who they buried her as." Amira stared at it for a long time. Something broke in her, and something else solidified. The Kavari hadn't just tried to erase her, they'd tried to erase the line she came from. But now that line was burning back through history, stronger, sharper, and still standing. As they descended the cliffs, the wind howled through the valley, a sound like mourning, or warning, or war. They returned from the cliffs with more than data. They returned with memory sharpened into mission. The stolen drive contained not just coordinates and ledgers. It revealed patterns, names embedded in coded deliveries, disguised beneath humanitarian aid and infrastructure budgets. Among them was one name that pierced Amira's world clean in half. General Vexlan Kaid, the same man who had paraded her execution video. The same voice behind the drone strike that failed to kill her. And now the same man whose name was attached to medical shipments that never arrived at the war hospitals they were intended for. Instead, those crates had been filled with ammunition and opiates. Blood traded for profit, pain processed into currency. She stared at the lines of data until her eyes blurred. This wasn't corruption, this was industry. Amira didn't speak for hours. Not to Inari, not to Jeevan. But when she did, it was with a voice like frost. "I'm not going to expose him," she said. Inari looked at her, startled. "What do you mean? Isn't that the whole point?" "No," Amira replied, pulling the photo of her mother from her coat. "Exposure is for people who still believe the system will correct itself." She folded the paper. "I'm going to destroy him." And she meant it, with a vengeance that outlasted injury, fear and doubt. Inari began compiling the list of co-conspirators, a digital war map of enablers and ghosts. Jeevan set up encrypted bursts to allies, still in hiding. Meanwhile, Amira returned to her oldest weapon, the one they had underestimated from the start. Not a gun, not a drone, her voice. She drafted broadcasts in a frequency the Kavari couldn't jam. Shortwave, bouncing between tower ruins and metal from downed ships. She didn't plead for attention. She struck with fact, with confession, with names, with recordings. And slowly over days and nights, whispers began turning into fire. In coastal towns, murals of her bloodied still standing appeared overnight. In desert strongholds, former defectors started burning their uniforms. And in the capital, fear. Because silence had become a scream, the Kavari responded with threats, arrests, executions. But even then, the cities they liberated remained tense. Because the more they spoke, the more they proved her right. One afternoon, while preparing for their next move, Inari returned from a supply run looking shaken. "They've put a bounty on your head," she told Amira. "How much?" 3 million. Jeevan whistled. Amira smiled faintly. "Cheap," she muttered. But the bounty wasn't the only message. They'd started rounding up anyone associated with her family name, living or dead. The old graves in Darund had been desecrated. The orphanage she once hid in had been torched. Even her cousin, who'd gone dark years ago, had been captured. It was no longer about war, it was about erasure, legacy, lineage. Amira stood at the edge of the canyon that night and stared at the burning horizon. They thought history could be cleansed with fire. They were wrong. History wasn't what got burned. It was what refused to go out. The plan wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. It just needed to be loud. Jeevan spliced the data. Inari decoded the last layer of encryption, buried under miles of code like bones under ash. And Amira, standing in the center of a crumbling radio observatory, prepared to deliver the message that would burn through every block the Kavari command tried to raise. "This is not a plea," her voice rang through the abandoned structure. "This is your warning." The transmission began at midnight. Pirated frequencies, buried stations, hijacked drones. Amira's voice was everywhere, from broken televisions in tenement homes, to stolen comms in rebel bunkers, to classroom intercoms, where children had never known anything but silence. It wasn't just her voice they heard, it was the proof, the receipts, the footage of Vexlan Kaid shaking hands with oil barons, whose mines had buried villages alive, of Kavari officers loading coffins, not with bodies, but with gold, of fabricated terrorist threats, used as excuses to drone wedding processions, and most damning of all, a video of Kaid himself, casual, drunk, laughing with other high officers over the girl who just wouldn't die. She stood there with a hole in her shoulder, and glared like a ghost. He slurred, like we hadn't killed her properly. It was the quote that lit the match. The broadcast cut across borders, carried by wind, defiance, and desperation. And when it reached the capital, people didn't riot, not yet. They waited, and watched, until one man in the central square, an old soldier missing half a leg, walked into the street, and played the audio through a rusted speaker on repeat. Soon, hundreds gathered, then thousands. The military tried to stop it, but even they hesitated. Some had heard the voice before, in the war, on the plains, in the ashes, and some had fired that bullet that didn't drop her. The movement had no name. It didn't need one, because now they all knew her. Amira, the girl who wouldn't fall, the woman who survived silence. And as the Kavari scrambled to regain control of the narrative, something unexpected happened. Cracks in the command chain. A lieutenant in the western region defected, live on air. A convoy in the northern plains surrendered, citing conscience. Entire outposts stopped answering central orders, not because they believed in her fully, but because they couldn't believe in them anymore. Amira stood in a bunker when the news came in. You did it, Inari whispered. No, Amira said. We've only opened the first door. She didn't smile. She was already thinking of what came next. Amira always knew it wouldn't end with a broadcast. Tyrants don't topple just because truth pierces the airwaves. They crumble when their own stop pretending the lies are worth dying for. But that morning, as the rebel signals multiplied, and the government's silence grew desperate, something else surfaced. A coded message, from someone inside the citadel, claiming they wanted to help, claiming they had access to the War Council's evacuation protocols, and proof of where Kaid would run once the walls fell. The message was signed with a name Amira hadn't heard in 5 years. Commander Vire, her old mentor, her shadow, the man who trained her, then vanished the night her unit was ambushed. The man who'd been declared dead, but whose eyes she'd seen in the surveillance tapes months ago, standing beside Kaid. This could be a trap, Inari warned. It is, Amira replied. But I'm going anyway. The plan was to meet in the outer ruins of Fort Kadera. No guns, no soldiers, just data, just the truth. She went alone, through the hollowed structures of the war's first massacre site. The wind cut like razors through her jacket. And then she saw him. Var stood in the old chapel ruins, aged and armored, a look of something between guilt and duty in his face. You're still walking, he said quietly. And you're still lying, she replied. He held up a chip. This has everything. Kaid's routes. The fails. He's private bunkers. You can finish this. And what do you want? She asked, not moving. Nothing, Varel said. But they'll come for me after this. He turned to leave, but Amira raised her voice. Why? Varel stopped. You trained us to believe in honor, in the oath. So why serve the man who burned all that to ash? He didn't turn around when he answered, because I couldn't stop him. Amira stared at his back. She saw the tremble in his fingers. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of what she might still believe. She took the chip. Then I will. She left him there. She didn't look back. Because traitors like him, they don't deserve closure. But that night, as she and Jeevan decrypted the data in the cold dark of a rebel cave, the screen blinked with something unexpected, a duplicate transmission, another broadcast, from Vire. It was his confession, all of it. How the War Council planned the ambush that shattered Amira, how they knew she wouldn't die easily,
but hoped the suffering would make her disappear, and how he, the man who trained her to stand, had been ordered to pull the trigger that tore her shoulder open. But in the end, he said, he fired an inch off. He gave her a chance, because despite everything, he still believed in what he once taught. And then the broadcast cut. The transmission source self-destructed, and Amira sat in silence. Not in forgiveness, not in grief, but in cold, ruthless clarity. Now the world had no excuse left. The broadcast spread like blood in water. By dawn, half the city had seen Commander Vaugh's confession. By noon, soldiers began laying down their rifles, and by dusk, the last checkpoint guarding the citadel's western wall was unmanned. But Amira didn't smile, she didn't celebrate, because tyrants don't die from truth alone. They get desperate, they burn everything, and Qaid still had teeth. Inari Jivan and a squad of rebels disguised in loyalist gear slipped through the chaos under smoke and sirens. Amira walked straight through the front gate, wounded, yes, martyred, yes, but never forgotten. The guards knew who she was, and did nothing. They had seen the videos, heard the voice of the woman who'd survived every betrayal they were ordered to inflict. Even Qaid's own officers began to vanish. A coward's court crumbling before the reckoning. Inside the throne chamber, Amira found Qaid alone. He was seated, not running, as if waiting, as if the weight of everything he built had finally crushed him too. She didn't raise her weapon. Neither did he. You should have stayed dead, he said, voice cracked. You should have stayed human, she replied. He gestured around the room. You think you've won? I don't care, Amira said. Winning was never the point. Qaid laughed, bitter and dry. I made this world what it is. Do you think they'll keep your peace longer than a season? Maybe not, Amira said. But at least I didn't make it worse. He reached for something on his armrest. Qaid rushed in too late. But Qaid didn't draw a gun. He activated a recording, a self-righteous message declaring himself a martyr, painting Amira as a traitor, trying to rewrite history one last time. Amira let it play, then she walked up to him, and without raising her voice, she said, "You always feared being forgotten more than being wrong." Then she shattered the recorder with a single bullet, and Qaid with the next. No trial, no spectacle, only silence. When she stepped outside, the smoke had begun to clear. The people had gathered, not cheering, not shouting, just watching, as if asking what comes next. And Amira raised her voice, not to command, but to confess. We are not what they made us. And the people bowed their heads, not in submission, but in memory. The woman they shot in the shoulder had remained standing. Now the world would too. After Qaid fell, the city didn't erupt in celebration. It exhaled. The kind of breath you didn't realize you'd been holding for years. The streets were quiet, not because fear still ruled, but because grief had no anthem. Freedom wasn't loud. It was heavy, and rebuilding was even heavier. Amira didn't take power. She refused every offer to lead, to govern, to sit where Qaid once sat. I don't replace monsters, she said. I bury them. Instead she helped form the first council, a rotating assembly of civilians, former soldiers, healers, and farmers. No titles, no thrones, just responsibility. Qaid became the people's voice, unpolished, blunt, but trusted. Inari returned to her books, documenting every atrocity, every small rebellion, every name that had been erased. She said, remembering was its own kind of justice. And Amira, she vanished again. This time not into prisons or exile, but into quiet, into villages that never knew her name, into orphanages where she taught kids how to throw knives and grow food, into temples where people still whispered prayers to false gods and prayed for peace anyway. Some say she died anonymously, buried under a tree without a single word on her grave. Others say she watches every revolution from a distance, waiting for the moment when she's needed again. But one thing is certain, when the walls of the old regime came down, it wasn't with a bang, but with a woman who refused to fall. They shot her in the shoulder, but she kept walking. They tried to kill her name, but it became a vow, not of vengeance, but of endurance. And every time another tyrant rises, someone always tells the story of the woman who stood and didn't stop. The city had been reclaimed, but the shadows lingered longer than the tyrants. Bullet holes don't argue when painted over. Torture rooms don't erase themselves. And memories, they rot or rage in silence. Amira knew this, which is why she never stayed long in places where her name became a hymn. She traveled to the south, where Qaid's reach had not been as brutal, but his influence still choked minds. She walked in plain clothes, no rifle, no blades, just questions. Do you know who you are without him? Do you know who you were before the uniforms? Do you remember the names of those you betrayed to survive? They weren't attacks, they were mirrors. And that was far more terrifying. Some towns asked her to teach, others asked her to leave. And in one village, she was stoned by people she had once liberated, because they feared that remembering her meant remembering what they let happen. Amira didn't retaliate. She bled, bound her own wounds, and moved on. Because she was no longer fighting for revenge. She was fighting for clarity, for reckoning. Inari sent word to her only once after the war. It came in a letter smuggled inside a loaf of bread delivered to an orphanage. It read, "You taught them how to endure, but have you taught yourself how to live?" Amira didn't respond, because she didn't know how. She only knew how to stand. One day, deep in the borderlands, she met a child, barefoot, no older than 7, carrying a handmade sling and a pouch of herbs. The girl had one eye and more courage than sense. When bandits came to raid the village, it wasn't Amira who stopped them. It was the girl, with a scream, with stones, with unrelenting fury. When it was over, the girl walked up to Amira, who had watched from the tree line. "You didn't help," the girl snapped. "I didn't have to," Amira said. And then the girl asked, "What's your name?" Amira paused, because no one had asked her that, without already knowing it in years. She could have said anything, but instead she answered, "I'm the reason you could scream." And she left before the girl could ask more. Because maybe the name didn't matter anymore. Maybe legacy wasn't in the sound of a name, but in the fire it passed on. Months passed, then years. And with them came whispers of trials, not the kind with gavels and powdered wigs, but something older, deeper. In the shattered capital, where the palace had once cast shadows over execution pits, a tribunal had formed. Not just to punish the warlords and soldiers, but to question the bystanders, to summon the silent, to reckon with the watchers. Amira returned, not to testify, not to condemn, but because she had been summoned. Not by the new regime, by survivors, by the mothers of the disappeared, by the daughters of the tortured. She stood before them not as a symbol, not as a soldier, but as a woman who bled. And they asked her, "Why did you keep fighting after they shot you?" Amira's voice was hoarse from dust and time. "Because they expected me to fall." A scribe recorded every word in ink, made from charred flags and melted shell casings. A woman stood up next, once a commander in Qaid's regime, now thin, blind in one eye, and trembling. She pointed a crooked finger at Amira. "You broke our lines, you destroyed our morale, you gave them hope." Amira said nothing, because truth often needs no defense. Another man, a defector, wept before her. "I killed 3 women in the resistance, but I spared a child once. He had your name carved into his wrist." Amira's jaw tightened. She hadn't carved anything, but others had. They'd made her more than she ever intended to be. More myth than woman, and myths were dangerous when believed without balance. So she spoke up, not with glory, but restraint. "I didn't win this war," she said. "I just refused to lose." One by one they came to her, some to ask forgiveness, some to offer it, others simply to understand how she kept going when others collapsed. And her answer every time was the same. "I stood because I saw someone else still crawling." That was the truth of it. The endurance wasn't superhuman. It was contagious. It had spread through prison walls, through whispered names, and scribbled notes hidden in rice bags, until even the most broken among them had something left to grasp. Hope born not from victory, but from witnessing defiance. The tribunal ended with no sentencing for Amira, just a moment of silence. For the nameless, for the faceless, for the ones who couldn't stand, but had given her a reason to. As she stepped out into the ruined streets, a child ran to her with a torn notebook. "Can you write your name here?" Amira hesitated, but then she wrote, "Not my name. Write yours. Make it matter." And she kept walking, because that's what standing does. It moves forward, even through ash. Years later, the war was a shadow stretched thin by time. Children played where tanks once rolled. Vendors returned to streets, once soaked in blood. But in a quiet village beyond the southern mountains, where the trees bent like old men, and the wind carried stories more faithfully than books, there stood a statue. It wasn't grand. It didn't shimmer in gold, or scream for attention. It was a simple figure of a woman, one arm wrapped in bandages, the other held out, not in victory, but invitation. Beneath it were 5 words: "She stood when others fell." People came from cities and farmlands alike. Some bowed, some touched the base, some left behind tokens, dog tags, bullet casings, torn diary pages. But the woman herself, she wasn't there. Amira never returned to the spotlight. After the tribunal, she vanished like morning mist. No interviews, no memoirs, no claim to power, because she'd already lost too many names to ever want fame. But her legacy didn't need her presence. In universities they studied her tactics, not the military kind, but the moral ones. How to resist without losing your soul. In prisons, inmates passed around a copy of The Silence That Screamed, a book someone else had written about her story. It became banned in 3 nations, which only made it spread faster. In refugee camps, girls whispered her name when they learned to walk barefoot across burning ground without flinching. Not to be like her, but to believe they could become something of their own. Somewhere in a dusty coastal village, a girl named Layan sat beside a fire with her grandfather. "Did you know her?" she asked. He smiled. "I saw her once, after they shot her in the shoulder." Layan's eyes widened. "Did she cry?" He shook his head. "She stood." "Why?" He looked at her with something ancient in his gaze. "Because the bullet wasn't the end. It was the beginning." Layan would carry that sentence into every storm of her life. And someday she'd stand too, maybe not in war, but in truth. And it would be enough. Because Amira's true legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was sewn into people's spines. The courage to keep going after the first wound. After betrayal. After the unbearable. That's why the soldiers had frozen when she stood. Not because she couldn't be hurt, but because she refused to stay broken. That was the final blow they never recovered from. Not the bullet, but the refusal to fall. And in that defiance, she became something even tyrants feared. A memory too alive to erase. Part 19. The last enemy she forgave. Word count, 985 words. The halls of the tribunal echoed with the rhythm of a nation on the verge of truth. Cameras clicked, lawyers whispered, and at the center of it all stood Amira, no longer dressed in combat gear or hospital robes, but a clean, simple black suit. She wore no medals. She came with no entourage. Just the scar that stretched from her left shoulder to her back, a line of memory and pain, never hidden, never glorified. Across the chamber sat a man the world knew as Colonel Devranilek. But to Amira, he was simply the last face she saw before the bullet tore through her. Time had rounded his face, thinned his hair, but his eyes, they were still sharp, calculating and full of pride he couldn't quite suppress. The charges read aloud were extensive unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, execution orders, and crimes against civilians. Because this wasn't about vengeance, it was about finishing the war properly. He was the last enemy still breathing, the last name on her list. When she took the stand, the room quieted like a church in mourning. The prosecutor asked her to recount the events, but Amira raised a hand. She didn't need guiding. Her voice firm, low, deliberate, cut through the stillness. "I was shot in the shoulder by the man who sits there," she said, her eyes locking with Elix. But the bullet wasn't the worst thing he ever did. It wasn't the camps. It wasn't the hunger. It wasn't the silence. She leaned forward slightly. It was the lie. The one he told the world, and himself, that we were nothing, that we deserved to be broken. Devranilek narrowed his eyes. And yet Amira continued, "We are still standing, and we are watching." Gasps swept through the audience. The judge nodded. The journalists scribbled furiously. Devran spoke then, for the first time. He smirked, his voice like acid in water. "You think this changes anything? Governments don't fall over tears and memories." Amira walked down from the stand slowly, then paused by his table. "I'm not here to make you fall," she said. "I'm here to let go." The room went silent again. Devran's lips twitched. "You're here to forgive me." Amira looked at him as if seeing a ghost she no longer feared. "I'm here to forgive myself," she whispered, "for believing I was only what men like you saw in me." And then she walked out, leaving him behind in a cage of steel and shame. Later that evening, under the fading light of a war memorial, Amira sat beside Layla, the young girl she once pulled out of a burning transport van. Layla had grown taller. Her eyes weren't full of fear anymore, but of questions. "You really forgave him?" she asked. Amira didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed a small photo in Layla's hand. It was old and faded. Amira's unit, back when the war was young and hope was scarce. "Forgiveness," she finally said, "isn't about letting them win. It's about making sure we don't lose twice." Layla looked at the picture, then at the woman beside her. "Will they remember us?" she asked. Amira smiled, her gaze resting on the flame dancing atop the memorial stone. "They already do," she said. "But we'll keep telling them anyway." And in that moment, with the stars above and the ghosts behind her, Amira understood the truth. The bullet had never ended her story. It had only started the one that mattered. The one that no one, no tyrant, no soldier, no silence could erase. She hadn't just survived. She had transformed. And now it was time to pass the flame to the ones ready to carry it forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from